Hey juniors, good to see you guys, sort of, again, figuratively. It's Sunday evening and I'm recording your lesson for tomorrow, Monday, November 16th. I'm going to talk about James Monroe, who is our last founding father president. So we had George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and now I'm going to finish up with James Monroe. You guys will have an exam on Wednesday, and it will be, again, a timed exam, and I'm going to open it up at a certain time and close it off at a certain time. And so it will not be an open note or an open notebook or open internet or open text friend kind of test. This is just you and the exam questions. So make sure that you prepare well for it. I'm going to probably tomorrow during the day slice and dice my PowerPoints from these last for these 5 presidents in a manner that removes all of the pictures and everything and just has the text so that you can use that to study. I would also encourage you to reread chapter 6 and then a few pages in chapter 7 that we'll talk about today. So anyway, we're going to jump into James Monroe. Make sure I'm recording. I am. Okay. All right. Let's see here. Happy Monday, by the way. Hope everybody's staying healthy. All right, so slide number 2 has a list of the presidents, the founding father presidents. Of course, John Adams is the only one of the bunch that only served 1 term. Everybody else served at least 2 terms. George Washington is considered a Federalist, even though he rejected party titles at the time. John Adams was a Federalist. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe are all considered Democratic Republicans. So Federalists, if you recall, are more interested in strong federal or centralized power at the federal level. The Democratic Republicans were more about states and states' rights. Jefferson was considered the lead of the Democratic Republican Party, and I would say Hamilton is oftentimes considered the head of the Federalist Party, even though George Washington was president. So, all right, the period of time of James Monroe's presidency, which was from 1817 to 1825, is oftentimes referred to as the era of good feelings, which is kind of funny that historians would call it that. But basically, James Monroe had the pleasure of serving at a time of peace. There was no longer the looming concern about getting dragged into a European war, either with the British or with the French. And so James Monroe had the privilege of having his predecessors lay all of that conflict to rest, and he got to focus on something called nationalism, a spirit of nationhood, and creating laws and policies that really try to establish our boundaries as a nation, what our foreign policy would be, and all of those sorts of things. So that's why it's called the era of good feelings. Just as a refresher, part of the reason James Monroe, at least I consider him one of the founding father presidents, is because he was intimately involved in America's independence movement. He fought in the war. He fought alongside George Washington. He was part of the very famous Battle of Trenton, was one of only a handful of soldiers that was actually wounded. He was shot, I believe, in the shoulder area. And so there's a couple of very famous paintings associated with James Monroe. He is not the center of the painting, but he is an important part of each of these paintings. The first one is the crossing of Washington across the Delaware River in the Battle of Trenton, painted by Emmanuel Lutz, which actually in 1851, he was a French painter. So of course this was painted about 75 years after the fact. And it is a idealistic impression of the spirit of that very important battle, with Washington and his men crossing the Delaware River on Christmas night. And it was, of course, a big success. Washington captured several thousand German Hessian soldiers, and it encouraged his troops to re-enlist for another year or whatever. I'm not sure how long they re-enlisted for, but it was a really big turning point for Washington. And in that painting, there are several interesting things. There's a woman on the boat. There is a black person on the boat, and then James Monroe is depicted standing right behind George Washington holding the American flag. Just kind of a side note about this particular painting, the flag that is depicted in this scene would not have been the flag that would have been present at the crossing of or during the Battle of Trenton. And so the artist misrepresented the time period, and so a lot of people will say something about that, but it doesn't matter. John Adams might call it bad history, but this painting was not intended to be a perfect representation of that night. It was more of the ideal of the spirit of that moment. And then the second painting you'll see there is a very famous painting by John Trumbull, who painted many of the paintings in the United States Capitol Rotunda that depict very important events in American history. And so this is another picture of the Battle of Trenton. It's the depiction of the surrender of the German British soldiers to George Washington. And James Monroe is seen behind Washington and his men in the center on the left-hand side, and he is wounded, and you can see he's being attended to, and he's bleeding, and so he is depicted in that as well. There are several other people depicted in this, and I was trying to find them. John Trumbull actually, I believe John Trumbull's brother participated in this battle, and I think he is depicted in the painting as well, but I don't have my chart to show. But anyway, it's a beautiful painting, and when you guys go to Washington, D.C., hopefully in the spring, you will be able to see this painting in person. Okay, so as James Monroe becomes president, the new nation is moving westward at a very pretty fast pace. A lot of that land that had been ceded to us from the British was being flooded with Western settlers who were hoping to get a good plot of land for a really reasonable price. Land was pretty cheap at the time. But as people moved west, unfortunately, the ongoing discussion of slavery has not been dealt with. And so there was a big concern by both abolitionists from the north and southern slave owners from the south about whether or not this new territory would be open for slavery. And clearly, I would say probably the preponderance of Americans were not interested in proliferating slavery. They were resigned to it in the southern states where tobacco and cotton were rice were the primary crops that were grown, but most Americans did not want America to become a land of slavery. I would venture to guess. Now, that doesn't mean they weren't racially challenged, doesn't mean that they believed in equity for all people, but the institution of slavery was kind of a stinky thing, and it was getting close to seeing the end of its time. And so I'm trying to think, slavery was finally outlawed in England in, I believe, 1836. The New Mexican government, after they threw off the Spanish in 1821 or 22, had outlawed slavery. So most Western civilized nations were distancing themselves from slavery. And so I would say probably the majority of people in America were like, we really don't want this to be something that spreads westward. But the southern slave owners and wealthy people of the South did not want there to be any opportunity for northern legislatures to outlaw slavery and ban it where it already existed. And so this question of this new territory becomes very problematic. There is a slide on the map that says slavery or no slavery, and you can see all of the land that is now open for settling that is up in the air about whether or not there would be slavery. Now, I will say that in the Ohio territory called the Old Northwest, which is Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, their territorial constitutions for the contract that opened up that land for settlement forbid slavery in those territories. So those were already off limits to slavery. But all of this other area called the unorganized territory in this map is up for grabs. And this is going to be a very crucial point for our country and for James Monroe. Moving to the next slide, just kind of a random factoid here. So John Quincy Adams, John Adams' son, has essentially grown up in politics. He went to Europe with his father when he was 14 years old during the American Revolution. His father essentially allowed him to go on to Russia, where he served as an American ambassador in Russia, and he worked for this ambassador for several years as a 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old. And so he learned to speak other languages. He learned to live apart from his family. He was very independent, very, very, very bright guy. Eventually he came back and he served in the Washington administration, was sent back abroad. I think he was sent to the Netherlands at that time. I believe that's where he met his wife. He also had a law degree. And so he was he was groomed to be a politician, and I would suspect that John Adams was grooming him to be president someday. John Quincy Adams might very well be the most qualified person ever to be president because of his background. This slide has several pictures of him. The first picture of him is a young man, probably, I'm going to say in his 20s. He lost his hair like his daddy did. And so the second picture of him is when he was Secretary of State for James Monroe. So James Monroe selected John Quincy Adams to serve as his Secretary of State. John Quincy Adams was probably much brighter than James Monroe. I didn't mention this before, but James Monroe comes again from that Virginia dynasty. Some of the historians that you'll hear in the video, they don't call him stupid, but he did not have the brilliance of a Madison or a Jefferson or a Hamilton. And so John Quincy Adams was his right-hand man. Helped him write a lot of foreign policy, helped direct him through some of the Western expansion situations that he came into. And then the last picture, or of those three pictures there, those color pictures, the last one is John Quincy Adams as president. He is going to serve as president, be elected as president after James Monroe. If you'll recall, before I told you, he's not considered a founding father president because he was just a young child during the American Revolution. So he probably remembered much of it, but he did not fight in the war. He was traveling, living abroad. And then the other two pictures of him, one of them, so John Quincy Adams is the only president to go, after he served as president, to go back and serve in the House of Representatives. So he served in Congress for about 30 years after he left the House of Representatives, or after he left the presidency. He served in the House after he left the presidency. And so he became the first former president to be photographed when the era of photography finally evolved. And so the picture of him sitting in his study with his legs crossed. Let me get my glasses on. Yeah, that is the very first, I believe that's the one. That's the very first picture of a former president being photographed. Now, he wasn't the first president to be photographed because his picture was taken after he left office, but kind of a famous picture. So the next slide has the definition of nationalism. As I mentioned before, James Monroe is going to be serving as president during this swelling period of nationalism. The War of 1812 is behind us. We've established ourselves as a worldwide power. We are larger than all of the British Isles, and I think Germany and France combined, the population of the United States. Our manufacturing is growing, our transportation systems are growing, our Navy is growing, and so we are in a good place. And so there's this swelling sense of pride, of nationalism, that I am no longer a Virginian or a Bostonian. I am an American. I'm not a New Yorker or a South Carolinian. I'm an American. And so this sense of national pride overcame regional differences, with the exception of slavery. And so the definition says the belief that national interests should be placed ahead of regional concerns or the interest of other countries. And so even, I guess you could say, even with the issue of slavery, a compromise is going to be forged to put national interest ahead of the interest of various regions. Some more pictures, just FYI. So this is the picture of John Quincy Adams as Secretary of State that was painted while he was Secretary of State. He served the entire 2 terms under James Monroe as his Secretary of State. Those are the paintings of the founding father presidents. And then the cutie patootie next to him, John C. Calhoun, is going to serve as James Monroe's Secretary of War. I wanted to put I wanted to include this picture because John C. Calhoun is going to come up over and over and over again. Hopefully his name sounds a little bit familiar because John C. Calhoun was one of the war hawks that was mentioned. He and Henry Clay, who wanted to go to war against the British in the War of 1812 and supported James Madison's push to declare war on the British. And he's going to, his head is going to rear its ugly head once again. If you'll notice a picture of him as an old man, he is one scary looking dude. Last year, I had a big picture of him, and it just kept showing up in different places of the school. People would steal him and put the picture in other places. Seth Weaver said that one time he went into the boys' bathroom and he opened the door, or he closed the stall door, I guess, and John C. Calhoun's old scary picture was staring at him. So anyway, we'll talk more about John C. Calhoun later. All right, moving on. All right, so the next slide says significant events of the Monroe presidency. So like I said, era of good feelings, no wars going on. So he is having the opportunity to set in stone some policies to govern the country moving forward. Probably the first significant domestic issue he is going to deal with is related to slavery. So the word domestic means that it's a policy or an issue that deals with the country here in our borders. Foreign policy deals with our policy towards other countries outside of our borders. And so the Missouri Compromise of 1820 was part of James Monroe's domestic policy. So long and the short of it is that slave owning states and non-slave owning states always tried to have a balance of free versus slave states. As long as there was an equal representation, they both had the same number of votes in the United States Senate. Remember, because each state gets 2 votes. And so there became a conflict because as Western territories were settling, Missouri was prepared to come into the Union as a slave state, but that would offset the balance of slave versus free. And also there was a question about whether or not the country wanted to continue to introduce slavery into those Western territories. So there's a lot of fighting, a lot of arguing. There began to be cries of civil war or disunion, secession of the southern states, because they feared that eventually what was going to happen is the North was going to tell them what to do, and that the North was going to outlaw slavery because they'll have more votes in the United States Senate. And they were like, why don't we just break up now? And so in the interest of the nation, going back to that nationalism, James Monroe and some of his colleagues within the United States House and Senate, Henry Clay being one of them, created a compromise bill which allowed Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state, but prohibited the introduction of slavery into any territories north of the 3630 parallel, with the exception of Missouri. So the southern border of Missouri is the 3630 parallel. So it is technically the only state that allowed slavery up until that point, but north of that line. And then the compromise also was that I think it would be Maine was going to enter the Union as a free state. So once again, we would have an equal balance of slave state versus free state. So effectively what the Missouri Compromise of 1820 does is it prevents civil war and it prevents southern states from seceding at that moment in time. It kicks the can down the road, it prevents the inevitable, and ultimately the Civil War happens because the big boys in Congress couldn't figure out a resolution to this. So it ended up in war. And then another huge policy of the Monroe administration, which you have to give credit to John Quincy Adams, who wrote it, is something called the Monroe Doctrine. And the Russians, as well as the Spanish, were trying to colonize areas in California, and some of the Spanish were trying to recolonize areas within the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico that had been relinquished by the French and whatnot. And essentially they wanted to come back and start recolonizing North America. after the United States has already been developed and moving westward with the anticipation that we're moving all the way to the west. And so people were like, whoa, 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 Russia can't colonize California, and the Spanish can't colonize this place and that place and the Caribbean and all whatnot. And so John Quincy Adams wrote a statement or a policy that basically said, no more colonization in the Western Hemisphere. Europe, stay out. This is our backyard, not your backyard. And if you start coming over here and meddling in our business, then you're going to have to answer to us. And we are a force to be reckoned with. We have a military, we have a navy, we have all kinds of trade entanglements that you will not want to lose. And so there was also the concern that allowing Russia and the Spanish to colonize in the West would interfere with our trade relationships with China, which was a big moneymaker for us and still is. And so, so James Monroe delivered this speech, I think at maybe a State of Union or some special event, I don't remember. And so it was a megaphone message loud and clear. And I think eventually what ends up happening is the Russians sell us some of their holdings in Alaska, and the Spanish back off. And so in the middle of Monroe's presidency, the Mexican Revolution happens and the Mexican independence movement happens, and they gain their independence from Spain. So, so that's really, really important. And the Monroe Doctrine guides our foreign policy for many, many more years to come. But it was actually written by John Quincy Adams. So colonization is over. There's a map here that shows you the line of the Missouri Compromise to get an idea. So all of that territory in the gray north of that line is off limits to slavery, which is going to be a dilemma because if you'll notice, that purple territory to the west, with the exception of the Oregon Territory, is Mexico. And so there's no place else for southern slave states to expand their slave territory. And so that's going to become a significant source of contention with the South. So, all right, that's pretty much it for James Monroe. I'm going to ask you to watch his president's video. It's not very long. So plan on studying for your test for Wednesday. The test will come open during your regular class time. It is not an open book, open note test. You need to study for it just like you would, and I'm going to trust you to be true to your word. And if you have any questions, I will probably suggest some video reviews as well, maybe some crash course history videos to watch as well. And then I'm also going to send you a PowerPoint that has each of those 5 presidents with the major significant events that they accomplished or things that happened during their presidency that you need to remember. So just pay attention to that as well. I think that's it. See you guys. Bye.